Well, good morning, everybody. It's just so good to be here. We've been away for, not sure, 4 Sabbaths, I think. We've had a trip to Perth, among other things. Just like to thank the worship team this morning. Thank you, Zeke, for putting all that together. And thank you, Lydia, for that marvellous kids story. That was lovely. Yeah, that was. I reckon we could leave church now and we could say we've had the sermon for the day. That would be great. Thank you, Tristan, for your special item. Thank you so much. At short notice, I only rang Tristan on Wednesday, I think it was, at work, and he was happy to step up to the plate and do the special item. I must say I'm on short notice as well. Peter rang me on short notice to see if I would do the sermon today, so that's all good. I'm going to do something today that I've never ever done before. I went to bed last evening at around 10 o'clock with the sermon all prepared for today. I woke up this morning and I thought, not doing that sermon just didn't feel quite right. And so I've opted to do another sermon. My sermon today is not going to be a long sermon. It will be a short sermon. I've already told the girls in the kitchen we won't be running late today. And so hopefully what I've put together will be of benefit to us and something that we can remember as we go through this coming week and through the coming months. Like I said, we've been in Perth for 2.5, 3 weeks. While we were boarding the plane, Sue's mum passed away. We did not know that till we got to Perth, so last weekend we had the memorial service. Pastor Peter came up and did a marvellous job there for us. So it's been a pretty busy 3 or 4 weeks for Sue and I, but as I said, it's good to be here again this morning. I did change the title of my sermon, and the title of my sermon today is Have We Become Immune to Shock? And Helen, your poem was very, very fitting for what I want to talk about this morning, and also Lydia's story was fitting about what I had to talk about as well. Now, the framework for this sermon actually came, and the framework and the bones of this sermon actually was started in my mind a few months ago when Rob Hill, is Rob here today?
Preaching in Kyogo.
Oh, okay, preaching in Kyogo, okay, good. Rob had a sermon here and he talked about a similar thing that I want to touch on this morning. Now, before I do the sermon proper, I'd like to tell you a story. And the story is about a blacksmith. It's about a dog, and thank you, Lydia, for your story about a dog, and a hammer. But before I go into the story, I would like to share a few Bible verses with you, and that will lead into my talk this morning. If you have your Bibles, and I hope you have, I would like you to turn to the book of Peter, 2 Peter, and we're going to look at chapter 3, and we're going to focus first of all on verses 3 and 4. And we find here the Apostle Peter is talking, and I'm reading from a paraphrased version, but you can follow me in whatever you've got sitting on your lap there. King James, New England, doesn't really matter. And this version says in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, beginning in verse 3, Peter talking first, he says, I want to tell you that in the last days, just before Jesus comes, there will be unbelievers everywhere. They will say, hey, what's the big deal? Why, as far back as we can remember, things have always been the same. And things will always be the same. The idea of Christ coming is just a tall story. And then skipping over to verse 10, Peter has this to say, Dear friends, in spite of what they are saying, remember with all your heart that the day of the Lord will surely come unexpectedly as a thief in the night. And then reading on in 2 Peter 3 further, Peter says, while you are waiting, be on good terms with God. Don't become tired of waiting or immune to shock. Don't become slow and forgetful. But, he goes on, but be excited and be full of energy, and whatever you do, don't go to sleep. I'm going to tell you a true story, a story I heard probably 25, 30 years ago now. But the bones of this story are still relevant in our thinking and the way we should be acting. And this is a story about a blacksmith. And this blacksmith lived in Mexico City, one of the densest populated cities in all the world. And he had a blacksmith business there. He had a big shed. And in the blacksmith shop, he would go every day and he would spend his day making things, the things that blacksmiths make. He made horseshoes, he made gates, he made springs for carts and for cars, and he made all sorts of things that required that metal, out of metal, anything that was required to be made out of metal, he could make it. And I fondly remember when I was a boy in the town where I lived, walking through the town, watching the blacksmith making horseshoes and also shoeing horses. And my best friend at school, my best mate at school, his dad was a blacksmith, and I used to love going to the blacksmith shop and watching him do his stuff. Now, in a blacksmith shop, there are many, many different types of tools. And example, in a blacksmith shop, I suppose the main thing sitting on the floor of a blacksmith shop would be what? An anvil, that's right, it would be an anvil. He also had tongs, he had bellows to stir up the fire, and he had an assortment of hammers, big hammers, little hammers, heavy hammers, light hammers, and also all blacksmith shops had a big water trough. So when they'd fashioned the article, whether it was a spring or a horseshoe or whatever, they would grab the article with the tongs and they would plunge it into the water trough, and that would then cool the item so as they could do further work on it. Okay, so early one morning when the blacksmith arrived at his place of work, he found that his blacksmith shop had been broken into and all his tools had been stolen. Someone had broken in overnight and they'd taken the lot. Now, this sort of thing had happened to the blacksmith before, and I can tell you, well, he wasn't happy. He was sick and tired of all this stuff that was going on. So what do you think he did? What would you do if you had a blacksmith shop and you arrived one morning and all your tools were gone, the front gate was open, the shed door the lock was broken? What would you do? Well, he thought for a moment and said, right, I'm going to go down to a place where they do alarms, and I'm going to get somebody to come and alarm this shed of mine so as if anybody tries to tamper with locks or break in, the alarm will be set off, and then I can come or the police can come and attend to whatever is going on. And he thought, no, that's probably going to be a little bit drawn out. So what I might do, I might contact a security company. And there was lots of security companies operating around where he was. And tonight or tomorrow night, they can come in and they can do a patrol of my premises 2 or 3 times during the night to make sure nobody breaks in. So he thought about that. No, that would be fairly costly on an ongoing thing, so he decided that he would get himself a guard dog. And so off he went to the local pound where they kept lots and lots of dogs. And there he tried to find himself a dog. And he decided that as he was driving along in his ute that he would go for a big dog. And he thought in his mind, after all, a big dog would tend to scare a thief rather than a small dog like a fox terrier or or a little dachshund or whatever. So he was on the lookout for a big, big dog. Lockie, do we have a big dog? Oh, wow, a big dog, thank you. And he was looking for a big dog. So he trudged along the rows and rows of kennels where they kept the dogs, looking here, looking there. And then out of the corner of his eye, he spotted the biggest dog he had ever seen. He spotted the dog that he was looking for. And it was a Great Dane Rottweiler cross. And I can tell you, he was a big dog. He was almost the size of a Shetland pony. And so the blacksmith named the dog Butch. I think that was appropriate, don't you, Butch? He did think about calling him Tiny, but he thought, no, Butch would sound a whole lot better. So he put a collar on Butch, and he put a lead on Butch. Don't tell me how he led him, because look at the size of him. And he spent a little bit of time getting to know Butch, and he patted him, and he gave him a few little tidbits, a few little treats to settle him down. And when Butch was comfortable with his new owner, then he bundled Butch into the back of his old ute. Don't know how he got him in, but he did. And then he went down to the local hardware shop and bought a ute load of tools. And then it was back to work for the day. And so when he got back to work, he tied Butch up. He gave Butch a bowl of water and some food, and then commenced to work again in his blacksmith shop. So he started heating, he started hammering, he started shaping, and now all this blacksmith stuff was new to Butch, and he liked what he saw. He liked the smell of the fire, he liked the sizzling of the water, and most of all, he especially loved the hammering. He loved the hammering. Every time the blacksmith lifted the hammer and struck the anvil, old Butch became super excited. He would spin around in circles and go around and around and around, and he would howl and howl and howl, bang, howl, bang, howl, bang, howl. This was new and he liked it. He became excited, big time. He couldn't control himself. The noise, but what was the blacksmith going to do about all the noise? Oh dear, he thought. He had to have a guard dog, so he had to put up with the noise. Now, if you were to go into that blacksmith shop a month, 6 weeks later, and if you'd walk in, you would find the blacksmith going bang with the hammer, bang on the anvil. But oh, Butch, what was Butch doing? Was he turning around in circles and jumping and growling and yelling and stuff? No, he was asleep in the corner, snoring. Bang, and he would snore the more. Snore, snore, snore. Different story now. You see, Butch had become immune to shock. He was no longer excited about the things he saw. He had become complacent. He had become very lethargic, and he had trouble keeping awake. Just like the foolish virgins, he had fallen asleep. 2 Peter 3, verses 14 and 15 says, "Remember, while we are waiting for Jesus to come, be at peace with God. Don't become tired of waiting or immune to shock. Don't become lethargic or forget what I have told you, but be excited about the good news of Jesus coming, and whatever you do, never ever go to sleep." The parable of the 10 virgins is found in the book of Matthew, chapter 25, and we'll just have a look at that briefly to give us a little bit more insight into what I want to talk about. And beginning in verse 1, it's 25, it says, "At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy. And what did they do? They fell asleep. But at midnight the cry rang out, 'Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him.' Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out.' 'No,' they replied, 'there may not be enough for both of us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves.' But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others came also, saying, 'Lord, Lord,' they said, 'open the door for us.' But he replied, 'Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour.'" In that story we find that 5 were ready, 5 were complacent, they had gone to sleep, and the door was shut. You know, like Butch, one of the problems we face as individuals, and I believe as a church, is that we have become immune to shock. Now, when Pastor Beth was here, Beth and I used to talk about this subject at length, quite a deal. Things that once shocked us and prompted us to think about end-time events now tend to become commonplace, and we seem to forget these things a lot more quickly than we used to. Now, I remember when I was a small kid or small boy growing up, there was a lot of talk in the 1950s about UFOs, unidentified flying objects, and how these things were going to come down to Earth, these UFOs, and we would be swallowed up by little green men who would rule the world. And this stuff was impacted in my mind. It scared me to think that this sort of thing might happen. And I remember vividly when I was just 8 years old, and I was out in the paddock when my dad was ploughing on his little grey Fergie tractor, and I looked up into the sky, and for the first time ever, I saw a jet plane going over, leaving a large vapour trail. And it was flying high in the sky, and because prior to the early 1950s, the only aeroplanes were propeller-driven, they weren't any jet planes, but that was the first time I had ever set my eyes on a jet, and the stream that it was leaving behind was quite thick, and I got really scared because I thought it was one of these UFOs coming in. And so I ran inside as quick as I could, and I got under the bed. And I'm not sure what I thought that was going to do, but I did it anyhow. I hid under the bed. And it was quite a deal of time before I came out, because I wanted that thing to make sure it was well and truly gone before I came back out into the daylight. Back in those days, if somebody was murdered, well, that was such a horrible thing. We would think about it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And now it is such a common day occurrence, and it happens so often, we hardly give those things a second thought. Back in the mid-2000s, I think around 2004, 2005, when the Filipino tsunami struck, 270,000 people lost their lives. Then we've had the tragedies for many years now in Iraq and Afghanistan, and all the stuff going on in Syria. And now Turkey's getting involved with the atrocities in Syria. We have Ebola epidemics in Africa. We have stuff going on in Sudan. We have all those riots that have been going on now for 15 or 16 weeks in Hong Kong. We have suicide bombers cropping up every other hour, killing people. Terrorists, we have Al-Qaeda, we have Taliban. We have in Australia, we have the Martin Place episode. We have Pakistan, where just recently 145 children, school children, were murdered in one day. We have all the atrocities going on in Somalia. And, you know, almost every day at home we receive 2 or 3 phone calls from scammers trying to make a quick dollar. All this sort of stuff is going on. We're all impacted by it, aren't we? And like I said in the beginning, while we were away in Perth, Sue left her car at our daughter Joe's place, and while we were away, somebody came in and stole the number plates. And when we got back, the first thing we had to do was go to the RTA in Tweed Heads and get a new set of number plates for the car, $120 worth. And the girl there said, look, this has become an epidemic. With petrol prices going up, there's more stolen plates around. Every day we get 3 or 4 people come in wanting to replace stolen plates. You see, what they do, they steal the plates, then they'll put them on their car, they'll go into the service station, they'll fill up the car chock-a-block, might be $100, 120, then they'll do a runner. They'll just take off without paying for the fuel. So when the service station reports the fuel, they say, okay, see Lynn, she just stole $120 worth of fuel. So we're on to her, hang on, plates were stolen. So they might have 10 or 12 or 20 stolen plates, and every time they go in for fuel, they screw a new number plate on their car, do a runner, and away they go. And that's the sort of thing that exists in our world today. And have we become immune to that? Does the evening news, when we see the evening news, shock us like it used to? Or is it like water off a duck's back? Is it because we see these atrocities so often that they don't have the same impact on us that they once had, remembering they are all signs that point to the second coming of Jesus? And I often wonder I often wonder how much stuff goes on in the world that we never hear about. We only ever hear the headlines, things that make world news. Who knows what else is happening out there that is never, ever reported? And you know, today, for those who came to Sabbath school at 9, 9:15, 9:20, whatever, and if you stay for the lunch and you go home, say 2 o'clock, in that space of time, 3 or 4 hours, 5 hours, 10,000 children will die of starvation and disease. That's something to think about, isn't it? While we're sitting here comfortable in our pews, while we're in there having lunch, 10,000 children, kids, young kids would have died because they don't have the food to eat, or they're afflicted with disease that takes them out and they don't have medical facilities to cope with that. How quickly will we forget all these things? Another tragedy will follow tomorrow, the next day, who knows where or when. But it will happen. Will we take it on board, or will we see it as another sign that Jesus is coming soon? Or will it go in one ear and out the other because we have heard it so many times? You know, we live today in a world where human survival is in the balance. And I took this quote off the internet just recently, and it says, civilization as we know it is coming to an end. And this is not the wacky proclamation of a doomsday cult. Rather, it is scientific conclusion of the best paid, most widely respected geologists, scientists and investment bankers in the world. Do you know that nearly 4 billion people in the world today live on less than $2 a day? Isn't that incredible? 4 billion people live on less than $2 a day. 1/6 of the world's population cannot read or write, so how are we going to reach them with the gospel? They cannot read or write, so that would equate to, not sure how many million people in the world today, but that's a lot of people who cannot read or write. They do not have access to a Bible. And knowing all this, do you know that less than 1% of what the world spends on warfare could supply schooling for every child on earth? Isn't that pitiful? 1% of what they spend on warfare, if that was put into education, it could supply schooling for every child on earth, and yet 1/6 of the world's population cannot read. More than 10 million people die each year in infancy. 30,000 people, 30,000 children under 5 will die today. Yesterday, 30,000 children died. Tomorrow, another 30,000 children will die. But do you know that there is enough wealth in the world to dispel poverty if Christian principles were put into practice? So these things are all reminders of how fragile our existence is, and we must be alert to the things that are going on around us. There is no time for sleeping. You know, we have been living in the dregs of time for a long time now. When our children were small, we did not think that they would ever go to school. We thought the second coming was as near as Scripture says, even at the door. And here we are almost 50 years on, and we are still here waiting, and observing the things that are happening in the world today. You know, as a group of people, as individuals, as a church, we may have become immune to shock. We may have become like old Butch, complacent and lethargic. The horrific world events may not impact us the way they once did because they are so common and so frequent. But the realism is, and we need to realise this, that these things are happening and that each day that goes by brings us closer to the return of Jesus, whether we've become immune to shock or not. 2 Peter, again in chapter 3, Peter has this to say, "But do not forget, dear friends, that a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. And while you're waiting," the admonition is, "be active, don't go to sleep. Remember, we are here for a purpose. Stay awake, don't become complacent, and become immune to the things that are happening all around us." Shall we just bow our heads? Lord, it is so easy to become complacent in the busy routine of living and working and paying bills and doing the mundane things of life. Help us not to be immune to all the things that are going on around us, but to see them as signs that your coming is at the door. Help us, Lord, to serve you, and in doing so help prepare others for your return. I pray in your precious name. Amen.